I want to talk about a remarkable book that I've just read, and it feeds into our ignorance, our learned ignorance. One of the problems we have with so many of the young people coming up is they're trained to be ignorant because they don't want to lose the people teaching them their theories, don't want the theories challenged, so they're trained not to be able to think. The book is called G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. It's by Beverly Gage. And what is so amazing about the book is that Beverly Gage is a Yale historian, and I really believe that she's liberal. She gives a leftist, let's say. She gives a lot of hints that is where she's coming from, and yet she's also an honest historian, and that means that it changes the way that Hoover is looked at, and Hoover was central to the entire history of the second half of the 20th century and what was happening at that time. Now, J. Edgar Hoover has always been a monster to the right, especially after he died and some of his activities, the activities of the FBI were revealed. Here, just as an example, is a 2022 LA Times op-ed by Nicholas Goldberg, the former opinion editor of the Times, and he says, Hoover was no American hero. He was a bigot, a racist, and a homophobe, a conspiracy theorist who amassed and abused enormous power, pursued his enemies unscrupulously, and trampled on the civil liberties of law-abiding American citizens. So that's the typical right-wing idea of J. Edgar Hoover. It has been for a long time, but has really become kind of the central idea of him. Clint Eastwood made a movie about him that kind of depicted him that way. So it's not just on the left anymore. Now, you probably know something about J. Edgar Hoover. He was the head of the FBI during the day of the Depression gangsters, John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd. Maybe you saw the good film with Johnny Depp, The Public Enemies. You might remember Hoover was a Nazi fighter during the war at home, a domestic Nazi fighter, getting spies and bombers off the street. He was also a big communist hunter. During the 50s, he worked with the House Un-American Activities Committee, which became famous because of the Hollywood blacklist, and he helped to bring down the State Department spy, Albert Hiss, along with Richard Nixon, helped to bring him down, the nuclear spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. You've probably heard that the FBI bugged the hotel rooms and homes eventually of Martin Luther King Jr., and that he used secret power to blackmail politicians to get them to do his own good because they all knew he knew whatever it was they were doing and who they were sleeping with and so on. You may also have heard that J. Edgar Hoover was a transvestite. That, according to Professor Gage, is not true, or she believes it not to be true. It's one comment made by somebody with a grudge. The story, when you hear it in the book, is not believable. It's very cartoony. But he was almost certainly gay. He carried on a lifelong relationship, almost a marriage, with his second in command, Clyde Tolson. We don't know if there was sex involved, but they were, partners for most of his life. Now, the FBI, what's so interesting to me and so important to me and relevant to me about this book is it shows the FBI growing in tandem with the vast expansion of the deep state. Remember, for most up through the 19th century, up until Woodrow Wilson, the Constitution serves to restrain the power of the government. It serves to keep the federal government from reaching into areas that it's not supposed to go in, right? And that was the whole point of the Constitution, was not to have a small government. We sometimes, Republicans and conservatives sometimes talk about small government, but the government was supposed to have full powers in its sphere, but its sphere was supposed to be strictly limited. And now, of course, we have a government that reaches into every sphere, the sphere of marriage, the sphere of your personal life, the sphere of crime, which is mostly supposed to be a state operation. They pass laws that are 3,000 pages long, so you have no idea what you're being governed by, and then the laws are interpreted by agencies that you didn't elect, who then, if you violate the law and you say, well, you're violating unfairly, you don't get a trial, you go before the agency that interpreted the law in the first place. So you now have this incredible, vast, deep state. And as this deep state was coming up, it began with Woodrow Wilson, who was, by the way, the Barack Obama of his day. He was a college professor, a college president. So the press and the left loved him, even though he was an absolutely flaming racist and in my opinion, a bad president. He thought the Constitution was out of date. He thought in this complex life we need experts, and the president should not be restrained by anything but his own vision of what his wonderful power should be. And J. Edgar Hoover was a very conservative man in both good and bad ways. He was a good man in that he understood the danger of violent crime and the danger of the death of religion, the danger of communism. He believed in the Constitution. He believed in limited government. But he was also a conservative man in not good ways in that he didn't recognize the moral necessity of desegregation and civil rights. He was an old-fashioned Southerner who believed in literal white supremacy. But his first and foremost care was the FBI. He wanted the FBI to be protected, and he wanted it to be his fiefdom. And so as the deep state grew, the FBI's power grew with it. And even though Hoover was repeatedly reluctant to expand the power and the scope of the FBI, the federal government was always insisting upon it to him. And he rode that wave of growing power until he became an integral part of this huge, deep state. So what you have is a guy, think about this for a minute, you have a guy who was beloved of William F. Buckley and the National View, the conservatives. They loved him for his conservative views and his conservative rhetoric, but at the same time, he was a tool of the Democrat presidents who had no qualms about the ever-increasing expansion of the deep state. So it was not a one-man show where Hoover was doing things. It was a dance between the Democrats who were engineering this vast expansion of government and this man who had, who they were using as their tool to do what they wanted him to do. So it was a kind of dance between these two in which the deep state grew and grew and grew, and Hoover's power also grew and grew and grew. Now, all of the things that Hoover is most hated for, almost all of them, originate with Democrat presidents, indifferent to constitutional restraints and eager to expand the power of the state, sometimes for legitimate reasons. For instance, during lynching days, Hoover just kept saying, it's a murder. Murder is a state crime. I cannot go in and do this. But then the lynchers would get off because the state was a southern state and they didn't really care about lynching, so they wouldn't do anything. And so, Hoover wouldn't move, and that ultimately forced a larger state. But there were other times as well. So, for instance, World War II, the famous internment of Japanese American citizens under suspicion of being traitors because they were Japanese. This was Franklin Roosevelt's policy. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, right, the patron saint of the left, and he basically said, his administration said to Hoover, we're going to intern all the Japanese. And Hoover was already interning foreign nationals who he thought were suspicious, but when they wanted to intern all of the Japanese American, here's from the book. Hoover spoke out against thinking of the war in racial terms. Hoover said, no man should be suspected simply because he is foreign-born or has a foreign name or accent. This is the villain of the right. They hate him. He wrote this in the summer of 1941. He said, Americans, unlike other nationals, are not a race. Americanism is an idea. He also had a legal argument, says Professor Gage. While non-citizens could be detained, the federal government had no constitutional right to detain U.S. citizens without due process, even in a time of war. Roosevelt listened to his generals who were telling him that the Japs, as they called them, they said a Jap is a Jap. That was one of his generals said. He said the Japs are an enemy race. The Japanese were an enemy race. And he sent out the army to round up 120,000 American citizens who were Japanese and intern them in camps. Roosevelt has never been held to account for this, but Hoover often is. By the way, I'm not trying to whitewash what Hoover was doing. Hoover was essentially acceding to this as he protected the FBI, and he was becoming powerful at the hands of these Democrats. I'm just simply saying this was a dance. This was something the Democrats were doing that Hoover was saying, I can ride this. He was an expert manipulator. He thought, I can ride this to more power. Hoover didn't like King. He didn't want there to be desegregation. He felt, probably rightly, that Soviet-linked communists had worked their way close to King. He had good reason to believe that. But it was Bobby Kennedy who, in the words of this book, Professor Gage's biography, G-Man, proposed something that even Hoover had not fully entertained: wiretaps, not merely on the communists around King, but on King himself. Bobby Kennedy and Hoover approved of these wiretaps, and these were supposedly revealed King's extensive sexual affairs with other evangelical black leaders, including a rape, which King allegedly watched and encouraged. But after King was shot, Bobby Kennedy made a famous speech calling for calm and sharing the grief of black citizens, and he is now remembered as a hero of the civil rights movement, where Hoover, a legit bigot, he was a legit bigot, but he is now takes all the blame for these bugs that were originally Bobby Kennedy's idea. LBJ, another leftist president who built the Great Society, a thing that I wish would be torn down root and branch. He was the one who pushed Hoover into spying on and bugging LBJ's opponents at the Democratic National Convention. So he wanted Bobby Kennedy bugged. He wanted the blacks who were coming in to replace trying to replace the Dixiecrats. He wanted them watched by the FBI. Hoover said, this is way out of line, but LBJ was the boss, and eventually Hoover knew where his bread was buttered, and he went ahead and did it. Did LBJ know about all the things, all these evil things that right-wing Hoover was doing? Here's what Professor Gage said on Mitch Jesser's show.
I think Johnson knew in a general way what the FBI was doing. So he certainly knew that the wiretaps and to some degree the bugs were in place, because those were sort of open secrets in Washington. The FBI was peddling a lot of information about King's sex life to reporters, to political figures. Johnson really liked that kind of political gossip. And it doesn't take a whole lot of deducing to figure out how they learn these things, right? So he knew about the very widespread surveillance.
So again, this is something that was going on in tandem. Hoover was a great communist hunter, and this is one of the things I disagreed with the book. Beverly Gage, being, I think, a leftist, continues, says, well, it was a Red Scare, and she keeps talking about it with some kind of skepticism, but in fact, there were spies in the State Department. A lot of conservatives like Joe McCarthy because they think he had to do with cleaning those spies out. He really didn't. He was really a loose cannon. Hoover didn't like him because he thought he was giving communist hunting a bad name, but it was, and there are a lot of people on the left say, well, it was Truman who exposed the spies. Truman was reluctant to do it. He didn't want to do it. Hoover did it. Hoover got the spies out of the government. She kind of denigrates the work that he did there, but I think it was really good. He was working with the army, who had these cables from the Soviet Union they were called the Venona cables, because they interpreted the codes of the Soviet Union, so they had information, but he didn't want to give those codes Hoover didn't want to give those codes away. And at one point, Gage sort of says that the left loved the Rosenbergs. They thought the Rosenbergs were pure martyrs to the cause. These are the people who sold nuclear secrets to the Soviets. And Hoover didn't release the fact that he knew they were guilty because of the Venona cables, because he didn't want the Soviet Union to know he and the army were intercepting their cables. And Beverly Gage sort of says, well, if he'd only told about the Venona cables, then the left wouldn't have been wrong about everything. But, that doesn't really play out all that well. There's one hilarious thing. Hoover, when I was a little boy, was a kind of a hero to me and my brothers. We were ironic about it, but we still thought he was pretty cool, going out there catching gangsters. We would go to the FBI building in Washington, which had a big iron fist of communism, a gigantic iron fist with chains linking the eastern countries together, and we really admired him. And of course, we admired Melvin Purvis, who helped track down Dillinger. But Hoover was gay, obviously, and he would send these little love notes to Melvin Purvis, and I was reading them. I couldn't help but think back on the fact that we just admired him as the essence of manhood. But the thing about this is it does reveal, too, Nixon was a good friend of Hoover, treated Tolson as if his lover, Tolson, as if he were his wife. Everybody knew about it, and it just reminds you that a lot of the shock and horror on the right, as well as about gay people, is a little bit hypocritical, because they always knew this was going on at very, very high levels. So here's my point about this, is that, when the founders of this country were discussing how to build America, they weren't always discussing issues. They were mostly discussing how do you take the beast of power and tear it into pieces so it's not so strong? How do you suppress that beast of power hunger in the human heart? And that was all that that America was about, all of that our Constitution was about, is how do we put the powers against each other? And that lasted for a long time until basically the coming of the 20th century, when that lust for power just broke through that cage and the beast ran loose. And Hoover took advantage of that, but it was the Democrats who were riding that beast the whole time. And it just gives a different image of what's going on then and what's going on now. That so many of the issues that we talk about, climate change, race, the national debt, all taxes, everything, it's really just about power. That's what this country is about. It's about, can you restrain power from the people who want it and keep it in the hands of the individual so each of us can make his own decisions? Right now, the answer seems to be no. The experiment seems to be failing, but the game's not over yet. That, though, is the secret history behind the corrupt deep state and the vast expansion of government that went on in the 20th century with J. Edgar Hoover at the center of it, but not the cause.